This man, I don't need any paperwork to introduce this man. Massad Ayoob is a dear friend of mine, long-term friend of mine, and gave me, I have to admit, one of the funniest moments I've ever had on my radio show. If anybody's ever heard the beer mug segment on my show with Massad Ayoob from 2011, it was absolutely hilarious, and it's a classic every year. Massad is here to tell us about how to appeal to emotions in the argument for the Second Amendment. The godfather of self-defense himself, author of In the Gravest Extreme, Massad Ayoob. Thank you, Massad, for being here. We appreciate it.
Oh, good morning, team. When I hear an introduction like that, I always want to go like this. You know, it's too deep for the boots, but at least I can save the watch. Sociologists have said that our fight, the gun control debate, if you will, is tied with the abortion issue as the most polarized debate in our nation. One rule of polarized debates seems to be the 10-80-10 rule. There's going to be 10% of the public and the voters who are solidly on one side, they're locked in concrete and they're not going to change, and 10% on the other with the opposing view who are just as unchangeable. But in the middle, 80% of people who may or may not be leaning in one direction or another, but are still open to arguments and open to logic. Historically, in this particular debate, we who support the right to choose to be armed to protect life, unlike the other debate, we get to be pro-life and pro-choice. Historically, logic has been on our side, and we've won a great many victories with that. The other side falls back on emotion simply because they don't have the logic, they don't have the legal principles on their side. Despite that dichotomy, I don't believe logic and emotion are necessarily mutually exclusive. If you look at, going all the way back to when Time magazine began to make gun control a big issue, I remember they would print the pictures of every victim after every single one of these horrendous mass murder atrocities. We need to bring forth the faces of the survivors. How many of you in this room have ever been in a situation where you needed a gun for self-defense? Not necessarily to shoot someone, but needed the gun to protect yourself from a human or an animal. Okay, the faces of those who raised their hands need to be seen and their voices need to be heard. Raise your hands if any of you in here, if any of your parents or grandparents ever needed to use a gun for self-defense, if only to ward off the criminal at gunpoint. Okay. Remind people you would not be here to talk to them if those parents or grandparents had not been the armed citizens that they were. If the other side wants to play the emotional game, we can enter that game, and we have a pretty strong hand of cards to play. For every time they can show a mass murder, and because they need to blame someone, they blame the gun owners and the empty symbolism of their gun control, we can bring forth the survivors and the progeny of those survivors who would not have been born if those people had not been armed. Let's look, for example, July 20, 2012, the atrocity at the Aurora movie theater. That crazy SOB had, we think, deliberately picked out the one theater that had a gun-free zone sign. And forgive me, but whenever I see gun-free zone, I see hunting preserve for psychopathic murderers. Walked in heavily armed, started shooting. He left a dozen dead and almost 60 injured. And as soon as he confronted the first armed person, the first responding officer, he dropped everything and surrendered like the coward that he was. Everyone remembers that, don't you? That was Barack Obama's key. Okay, here's my chance to make my big push for gun control. And the gunfire from that Aurora theater echoes today in the arguments that all of us face. The next time you hear that argument, remind them that in that same city, Aurora, Colorado, 3 months before that atrocity, another monster showed up, this time at a church, drew a gun, opened fire. He had time to claim a single victim. He murdered the pastor's mother. That was his last chance to pull a trigger because an armed parishioner drew their legally carried gun and shot him dead on the spot. They don't tell you about that one, do they? I don't like to use these SOBs' names and give them credit even when they're dead. I'll give you this one so you can look it up, because people will tell you it never happened and you want to be able to show them the link. The monster's name was Kiaron Parker, K-I-A-R-R-O-N, Parker, common spelling. An ex-con, a prohibited person with a gun, stopped by an armed citizen. And God knows how many lives that armed citizen saved that day. Actually, he was an off-duty cop. Whenever I was an off-duty cop, I considered myself an armed citizen. The only difference between the armed citizen and the off-duty cop is one is carrying on a piece of tin and the other is carrying on a piece of celluloid. And if you want to stay in Colorado, go half a decade before that, in the year 2007. One of these monsters opened fire in the New Life Church parking lot in Colorado Springs. Shot his first few victims, burst through the door with an AR-15, and he was met by an armed citizen, a former cop, now a private citizen. Her name was Jeannie Assam, and she ran toward him with a Beretta 92 pistol in both hands, shooting, filled him with so many 9mm hollow points he went to the ground with just enough life force left to put the gun in his own mouth and finish his own job. And George Bush, the President of the United States at that time, credited her with having saved countless lives. And let's go back to 2012, this time in Connecticut, the atrocity at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. Today, we have the armed teachers movement. You'll see out here in the hall the display from the FASTER group, who have been exemplars of training school faculty, volunteer teachers who are discreetly armed, trained to a police shooting skill level, and who make the point of telling the public this school system is armed. You will not know who the armed teachers are, neither will the children for that matter. But if you enter this place with deadly weapons to harm these innocent children, we'll kill you. Have you noticed there have been no school shootings in the state of Ohio since the FASTER program began? The other side counts the deaths and they dance in the blood, and they ignore the survivors. They ignore the fact that every study of DGUs, defensive gun usages by armed citizens, more than 90% of the time it ends without a shot fired when the predator realizes, oh poo, or words to that effect. I am about to die from a sudden and acute failure of the victim selection process, and I am leaving now. Those don't get counted, but they're counted in the study a few years ago by Professor William English that determined decisively there are an estimated 1.67 million defensive gun usages in this nation every single year. Those are figures. The figures are on our side. The public needs to see the faces. We need to have testimony in front of legislators, in front of television cameras, from those who are alive because they or their parents or another loved one carried a gun lawfully and used it for its protective purpose. And as we reach out to those 80% in the middle, one thing I've found, if you can show the undecided person that they have already made a decision very similar to the one you're urging them to consider, you're on your way toward winning that argument. And the argument that I found to be extremely effective in that is this. I consider the defensive firearm to be a direct analog to a fire extinguisher. Each of them is an emergency life-saving rescue tool. It's intended for the first responder, the individual at the scene, to immediately take action and preserve innocent life, to hold off death and injury until the trained professionals of the heavy equipment can get there to take over. Now, let's go back in time a little bit. To look at me, you can see how old I am. I was born in the year 1948. Back then, people didn't have fire extinguishers. I remember one of my strongest memories as a little boy is walking past the fire extinguisher in the kitchen that was bigger than I was. You young people in here will need to Google it. Those of you my age, I see enough white hair out here, you guys look like a box of Q-tips from up here. It was a big copper or brass cylinder, stood about this big with a hose. You had to take it down to the fire station once a year to get it recharged. I remember the first time I went with my dad, how the people at the village fire station were patting him on the back because he was the only guy who kept one of these at home in the neighborhood, except for the firefighters themselves. Today, is there any one of you in here that doesn't have a fire extinguisher in your home? How many have them in your cars? Yeah, because society figured out the timeline. Okay? That fire blooms on the kitchen stove. You've got to get to the phone. You've got to call 911. The dispatcher has to transfer it to the fire department. They've got to suit up, get in the vehicles, and get there. Response times for emergency services vary wildly, whether it's police, fire, or EMS, emergency medical service. But the single most commonly quoted figure we hear is nationwide, an 11-minute average. And by the end of 11 minutes, if nobody's done something about it at the scene, the entire house is involved and everyone still inside is dead from thermal burns or smoke inhalation. The society figured out when that fire blooms on the kitchen stove, if you could just grab the fire extinguisher right there, kill it in its nest, the only loss is a few $100 in smoke damage and maybe a new stove. Audience participation. Raise your hands if you know CPR. Virtually all of us. Now, back when I was born, if my parents had gone to the family doctor and said, "Doctor, show us how to do closed-chest cardiac massage," which is what they called it back then, doctor would have looked at them like they were nuts and said, "You want to learn that? Go to medical school. That's something we do for a patient in extremis." And society figured out when that heart stops beating and that person falls to the floor, within 5 minutes, irreversible brain death begins. 5 minutes to irreversible brain death, 11 minutes to the ambulance arrival, carry the one, and society figured out. And today you're considered socially irresponsible if you don't know CPR, if you don't know the Heimlich maneuver and basic stop the bleed. Ask yourselves, what is the difference? The defensive firearm is a direct analog to an automatic electronic defibrillator that many of us keep in our homes now, and the fire extinguisher, emergency life-saving rescue equipment for the first responder. And the people who are in the middle are going to think, wait a minute, I've got one of those fire extinguishers. And the people who are telling me to vote for gun control are saying, well, gee, they'd only want a gun if they wanted to kill somebody. By that standard, do I have a fire extinguisher because I want my house to catch fire? Do I know CPR because I want my grandmother to have a heart attack? Wait a damn minute, somebody's lying to me. And one thing you'll find in any debate, when the other side lies, do not despair, rejoice. They've given you the tool to defeat them. All you've got to do is prove the lie. Anyone in here been on jury duty, done jury duty? Those who've done jury duty, I'm going to ask you to stand up, please. I'm going to ask you a yes or no question. You know, in court, when they ask you a yes or no question on cross-examination, you're being set up, and I'm not going to set you up. I'm going to ask you to sing out hard the word yes or the word no. When you found one side lied to you, did you believe another damn word out of their mouths? No. Thank you. No further questions. And that's how it works. We have the logic. We have the law. Attorneys learn in trial tactics. If the law is on your side, pound on the law. The facts are on your side, pound on the facts. And if neither the law nor the facts are on your side, pound on the table and pound on every witness the other side brings up. The law and the facts are on our side. That's why the other side uses only emotion, only the pound on the table. We have the cards. We are the ones who are carrying those guns to protect lives. And not just our own. They'll say, ooh, you carry that gun to protect yourself. You'd kill somebody else. You must be the most important person on earth. No. We carry these guns because every one of us in here has more to survive for than our own hedonic pleasure. How many of you, raise your hand if as you sit here now, you have a key to your home on your physical person? Raise your hand if as you sit here now you have some piece of government-issued ID on you with your street address, not a P.O. box. All right, you realize if you allow someone to overpower and murder you, they know where your family lives, they have the key to your house now, and you cannot warn your family that they are coming. That's one of the reasons we carry guns. How many parents do we have in here? Did you ever have a kid? Raise your hand if your kid ever said to you, "I didn't ask to be born." Well, they didn't. They're telling you the truth. We carry these guns because we, who brought these children, our children into the world, have an absolute duty to them to stay alive, to shepherd them through this unforgiving place as long as we can. Those of you in here are married or in bonded relationships. You carry that gun because you have a covenant with another human being. You're going to grow old together and take care of each other. You young people in here, you have that gun to spare your parents the unnatural grief of burying a child. Let the other side know. And most people say, trust your guts. I always told my kids, no, looking Grey's Anatomy, your guts are full of shit. Listen to your guts, run it by your brain, and remember a final lesson, because I've just run out of time. In between the guts and the brain is here. Sometimes you have to touch their heart to make them open their minds. Thank you.